this is like a false sense of confidence, but like because I know so many people who work in the film industry, it felt like, oh, I could do this, whereas like to publish a novel, like I don't feel like I have that understanding of
Totally.
that industry or whatever. So it did feel like the easiest hurdle too.
Today's guest is Meghan Best, whose career has spanned education and law in the fight for social justice. She started as a high school teacher in Brooklyn, later becoming dean at New Road School in LA. After law school, Meghan worked at the Children's Defense Fund, California, where she helped write SB 439, ending the arrest of children under 12. In this episode, Meghan shares the challenges of working with incarcerated youth, how her experiences shaped the writing of her short film, What Freedom, and her journey from teacher to lawyer to writer. We also dive into the realities of the juvenile justice system, the emotional toll of her work, and how becoming a mother influenced her creative process. Let's start the show. I'm super excited to have you on. Honestly, it's I know we hang out frequently, and we dabble a little bit on this subject, but I'm very excited. The idea of what you've done from coming out of college to going to law school and then writing this script, which is a special script. I see why it's gotten the momentum it has. It's a really interesting zigzag, if I can put it that way, of sort of where your trajectory is. But I sort of want to start on the script, and I want to start with something specific, which is what is your relationship to Magna?
To Magna?
Yeah, to Japanese anime. Do you
Oh,
have any background in
manga.
it?
um,
Did I say Magna? I meant manga. I
Manga.
don't know why. Yeah.
So my relationship is when I was a high school teacher, it was very popular because it's, just for background, I taught like the lowest level readers in high school. So I would teach ninth and 10th graders who were reading like below a sixth grade reading level. And manga is such a way to get them excited about books, and then sort of segueing into more wordy books. But that was always like such a gateway drug to like instill an excitement for reading. And then I sort of carried that through with my clients when I would represent juveniles accused of crimes or juveniles who were incarcerated, because again, it's something to do. It's gateway to reading more. And this particular book, a lot of my clients read. I had actually never heard of it until one of my clients introduced me to it, and he actually asked me to buy it for him. I'd never heard of it before. So I would say like my personal relationship is not strong. Like I don't read it a lot, but this particular story is really fascinating because the idea that these people are subject to a greater power, these titans, right? And so they are not in control of their own destiny, and they still feel some agency to fight back, even though their lives are not established in any way to fight back. So it's really more about that particular story and the idea that kids really like it. I don't know. That was kind of it. But what's funny about that is like it's such a tenuous thing. And then when I met the person who would direct the film, he's obsessed with that story. And he's watched every television episode, and he was like asking me all these deep questions about, and I was like, I can't really answer these. I've read like a few here and there. Um but
So that's sort of where I want to go, because I didn't know about the specific story you're talking about is Attack on Titan,
mhm.
and I had to do a little research on it, and because I'm a layman when it comes to this, but briefly, and I'll do a very butchered version. I'm sure there's going to be comments about how brutal this is. But it centers on the civilization inside of three circular walls. Uh, and this seems as the last of humankind is known by the inhabitants. The walls protect the inhabitants from gigantic man-eating humanoids. They're comprised of pure titans and titan shifters. We don't need to go into too much detail there, But there's a lot of symbolism in that story that is really interwoven throughout the What Freedom script that you wrote. And I just sort of, for people who are soon to see it and hear about this, I wonder. I have a lot of questions about it, and I think that serves as a good springboard to understand a little bit more of your background and where you came from. But I'm wondering if you might um, share with us the general thesis behind what freedom's communicating, and what the genesis of it was.
Yeah, so I think a lot like Attack on Titan, right? When you look at it from one perspective, it's these huge walls that are protecting people. And then the other perspective is they're locked in, right? So it's like I feel like that's a lot of the sort of injustice of our society in many ways, right? The patriarchal forces that we say like, "Oh, you're better off if you go to this juvenile detention center. You'll be better, blah blah blah." But it's actually just stripping young people of their humanity and their choice and their ability to overcome that restrictive lifestyle that they're so accustomed to in their formative years, right? So I think that, like, that's also true of education to a certain extent, especially in America and especially what we're seeing now in America, right? Like, I mean, I taught in New York City, so we don't really deal with censorship as much, but think about Florida or other book banning states where it's like, this is for your protection. But in doing so, we're actually limiting the ability of these young people to explore in any path they might want to. Um, so I think I've always just really butted up against that, I don't know. It feels very natural to me to always question things like that since I was really young, and, I think that, like, my professional choices have reflected that, and then I would also say that my professional choices have sort of multiplied that fervor as the years went on.
So I think that's where I'd like to sort of dig in a little bit, because um, your representation of juveniles in this circumstance is really unique. It's such a small sliver of humanity that has insight into this unique perspective of what is entailed, what these young people endure, where they're coming from. I think there's a lot of inaccurate assessment of these individuals, and there's a lot of bullhorny type of pundits who like to speak about this or that without having any real context. And from your perspective, being on the inside, let's just start with what do you think most people from the outside making sweeping judgments miss? What do you think we don't see?
Like, you mean, about young people or about the institutions themselves? Um, well, I think one thing about the institutions are that they don't help. And I think that the general population thinks that they're serving some sort of valuable purpose. And I mean, I guess if you value incarceration on its own as a form of punishment or removing people from society, then yes, they serve that purpose. But if you think that juveniles are being rehabilitated in these areas or in these institutions, then you're wrong. These are not like rehabilitative, and if anything, they're dangerous. And you know, just let's not even talk about incarceration, but just once you're arrested as a young person, your risk of being rearrested or reoffending increases exponentially. So think about once you're incarcerated and you're learning that way of life, then your risk of being reincarcerated also exponentially increases. So there's no like, oh, you're better now, you're out, right? So I think that's a big misunderstanding is that these actually function to make society better or make young people better. They're dangerous places and oftentimes they're making life way worse for these young people and their families. And then in terms of young people, you know, I think there's like a lot of, well, they did the crime, right? So like they did the crime. Why should they not be incarcerated? That's just the way that Americans look at crime and punishment. I mean, there's a lot of reasons why I disagree with that. And I think even the most progressive thinkers about, which I don't claim to be, but like the most progressive thinkers still are like, well, we can't do anything else because nobody will invest in anything else. Like this is just like there's no breaking this mold. And I think there's a lot, like, let's be honest, like there's so much racism. Almost every young person incarcerated is a person of color, especially in Los Angeles County. Um, and I think when you're a nation built on slavery, like it's really hard to break out of that cycle. And I don't think that people think, oh, well, we're 200 years removed from that, or we're less than 200 years removed from that. But so that things must be different. And it's like, no, no, no. Like those things are so pervasive that I think you look at young people who are incarcerated, and there is the first instinct of most people in America is like, well, they did something to deserve that, you know? But it's like, I don't know. I messed around when I was a teenager. Like I never came close to
Sure.
being arrested, you know? So I don't know what that deserving thing is, or where we as a society decided that like young people are deserving of these harsh punishments, these draconian punishments. This isn't how every culture looks at young people. This is just how our culture looks at young people. And, it's just really depressing.
Well, so these are sort of generally broader concepts, and I want to bring it down sort of into the real world because
Okay.
your protagonist Kadeem,
Yes.
um, in the script is presumably modeled after a or several individuals you represented as a social worker, as a legal representative of these juveniles.
Hmm.
Can you, and if it's, I think it would be interesting because you never provide that context on Kadeem, what put him in there in the first place, and just for the benefit of those who hopefully see this when it finally comes out. But he's at a juncture within his sentence of determining what his next steps are, and he's presented with an opportunity to use his own agency to determine that fate.
Hmm.
And it really tests what his decision making powers are and where that comes from. So
Hmm.
I won't sort of give away that component because you do an incredible job of moving this sequence through in a very short order, through pretty interesting dialogue, not just between the social worker and Kadeem, but also between him and the officers within the detention center. But I'm wondering if you might give us an example, if not Kadeem himself, but who that represented, what puts them there, where do they come from, and what are you seeing through the months and weeks and years of representing these kids? Or what are your takeaways in sort of that experience?
Um, so this one was pretty specific because I had a lot of clients that we called dual status, which means they were both in the juvenile justice system, but they were also in the dependency system, meaning they don't have family. So they were either in foster care or maybe just bouncing around group homes. And I bring that up specifically because these young people tend to be lost in the shuffle the most because, and this was sort of, it's not explained fully because it's too niche, but like my idea for Kadeem is things I've seen with multiple clients where if you get into a fight in a group home, right? Like I think you're an only child, right? But like if I got into a fist fight with my brothers growing up, my parents took care of it. If you get into a fight at a group home, generally the police are called or a probation officer or something that is way more punitive. Um, and I've seen that. That's the worst. And I've seen that because that cycle plays out over and over again. So that was sort of what I had in my mind. Probably an assault, a fight that kids get into. It's pretty common for teenagers to fight. But when you don't have parents and you don't live with family, the fight comes with much heavier risk. And that's kind of what I was thinking with him. So just kind of showing that, like, it's really hard when you're without options to break out of this cycle. And that's why he's kind of like, he's been in there, and he's also been to group homes, and he's also been to this ranch, which is sort of like they have these working places. Um, and he knows that, like, if he goes to a group home, the chances of him getting in more trouble increase because it's just so hard to, like, get in there and feel comfortable. Um, so I've seen that a lot. Um, and I would say with those particular kids, these are the types of hearings we would mostly have. I mean, the juvenile justice system in California is pretty regulated in terms of, like, timing. So, like, once you're arrested, you have to be heard the next day. And then they set you up on a schedule where it's like, then the next week you can plead or whatever, and then it keeps going. But it's all codified in the law. So unlike, say, adult court, I'm sure you've heard horror stories of people being locked away in Rikers Island for years and never even being heard on their case, right? Like, that doesn't happen in juvenile court. So these types of things is mostly what kids will have to do, is like, where's their placement going to be? And if they get there and they get bounced out, they're back in the jail again. And then we have to go through this process again of finding them another place to go. So that takes a long time. And that's kind of what I was highlighting. He just doesn't have anywhere he can go. There's just no spot to land.
Well, and so you sort of talk about he resists the idea of going back to a home. He'd rather be, and this is such a butchered layman approach to explain this, but he wants to be considered an adult and be able to go survive and exist as a full blown adult. The challenge that the system and the representative alludes to is that the skill sets may not be there at this point yet. So, and I keep inherent in what you're discussing, the the idea between punitive and rehabilitative, those opposing thoughts seem to keep creeping into my mind. For somebody who's never seen a juvenile detention center, how rehabilitative is it? Are there mechanisms that instill skills that allow these individuals to come out stronger or in anywhere more capable than they went in? Because presumably they're going in, if you're going in at 15, you're going in at 13, you're talking, you know, eighth grade education, maybe a fifth, sixth grade education. And in this case, he's in a foster home. So what happened? What landed him in the foster home to begin with?
Could be anything. I mean, I've met formerly incarcerated youth who were in, like, a food fight in their cafeteria, and the cops were called and they were arrested, and that's when, like, everything started. I had a client who was in the foster care system since he was 3. His mom was murdered. And, who else? There's no one else to take care of him. There it could be a number of things. Um, but it's mostly either death of parents or abdication of parenthood in some way, either like drug addiction, or they're incarcerated themselves, which is pretty common, or something happens that takes them out of their home. And then once you're out of there, it's a lot easier to get picked up by the probation department in Los Angeles County. But the school question is a really good question, because obviously I'm very passionate about that as well. And it's just like, it's sad, it's like there's like a lot of sheets or like online programs, because you think about the challenge of, like, differentiating all different ages, all different great accomplishments, and they just kind of decide to do the least possible they could do. I once experienced this group home that was in, like, the San Gabriel Valley, and they had their own school, and it was on a property of another school, but it was a trailer in the back corner of the parking lot. And it was like, because that's not equal education, right? That goes against Brown versus Board of Education. Like, you can't have separate, it's inherently unequal, as we know from the Constitution. So they, like, had all these worksheets, and this guy who barely talked to them, and, like, that was their schooling just because they lived in the group home, so they were formerly incarcerated. It's just, like, gross and the worst possible scenarios you can imagine. Does that answer your
This
question?
is Yeah, it does. I mean, I think there's a lot more to explore there. We obviously can't cover all of it in
Yeah.
a short time frame, but it's sort of the gift that keeps taking, right? Because and it's unfortunate that this is sort of my brain goes, but I've seen family members fall victim to Alzheimer's, and just aging adults whose future is narrower than their past,
Hmm.
and with a more myopic view, with it breeds a lack of optimism and hope for what you can accomplish. Because when you have hope, you can remain inspired, you can get up and do more things. But this sounds eerily similar in that, what I'm effectively doomed into this system where even when I'm released at 18, not only am I lacking in the skills to be effective at competing against others in obtaining employment, I'm already sort of behind the eight ball because I've got this history behind me, not to mention the emotional scars from having to navigate this on your own and without any emotional support. The idea of being isolated for the bulk of your formative years seems almost irreparable in recovery. I'm curious if you've maintained contact with others who've gotten out of the system. Are there success stories? How do you see some of those futures playing out?
Yeah. That's a great question. And first of all, yes, your analogy with Alzheimer's, I've never heard anybody say it, but yes, that is like a really beautiful analogy. Sad, but beautiful. And it's just sort of, it's exactly like that. And also, I would add to that, like, think about people who love someone who's suffering from Alzheimer's or people who love someone who's incarcerated. It's sort of also, it has a ripple effect, right? It limits what your experiences are going to be with that person as well. So if like a mother whose child is incarcerated, right, you can already see the future with your child narrowing, and that's sort of heartbreaking in its own way. But your other question, remind me what it was.
Just, I mean, what do you see? I'm
Oh
sure
yeah,
there's a
success
spectrum of
stories.
outcomes.
So there's really good organizations in Los Angeles who do a really good job of supporting people who are formerly incarcerated, especially youth. And some of them are even run now by formerly incarcerated and system impacted youth. And so they do a lot of great work, like in the political sphere in Los Angeles. So, like, when I worked at the Children's Defense Fund, we worked with all these system impacted youth who were really leading the charge in terms of like coming up with policy ideas, lobbying for those ideas, organizing people to show up to, comment at Board of Supervisors meetings, everything. So I've seen this happen, right? And then once they have the confidence of like, okay, well, I just did this, I can, I just did X and now I can do Y. And you could see the ripple effect of like how success impacts and community impacts their future. So it's not like hopeless, right? But it's a challenge. But yeah, I've stayed in touch with people like that, and it's really nice to see.
Well, and I sort of think about momentum, right? Because um, for better or worse, we're all products of our genetic lottery.
Mm.
And when you have some momentum with just a couple of parents that are supportive of you and loving, you end up generating momentum from that, right? I mean, that's a good central place to get going. And so by the time you're 18 and you're presumably starting to develop your own acuity as an individual, you've garnered some successes, you've garnered the momentum of that achievement. In many ways, these unfortunate souls seem to be walking out of here with starting from ground zero, where others have had some form of momentum. In that vein, I sort of want to talk about your momentum because there's a through line through some of your history, right? And I'll let you deduce this where you see fit. But couple of facts that I think are interesting, more than a couple. One, you're raised on a nursery on Long Island. not in Long Island, but on Long Island.
Yep, that's correct.
Uh, your dad was a special ed teacher,
Mm-hmm.
correct?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
You ended up jumping colleges a lot, but ended up at Hunter, where you were the minority for the first time.
Mm-hmm.
You ended up working in an automotive high school in Brooklyn. And then eventually you ended up going into law. Is that a fair general
Yeah.
trajectory? Talk to me a little bit about what stands out in sort of, you, tell us a little bit about that journey, but I am curious, landing in representing as a social worker juveniles.
Well, I was an attorney, not a social worker.
Fair enough. Okay, but my only point in representing them, you get a law degree, you can go off and make a very good living,
Yeah.
but you chose not to do that. That's where I'm going with this, right? Because you chose to do something that aligned more with what I would assume your more purpose is.
Yes. I
Is that
only
a fair
went to law
assessment?
school to do this.
Okay,
That
so
was the
talk to me
only
about
reason
that.
I went.
That's what I would like to hear about.
So I think my parents, a lot of people, their parents are like, you could be whatever you want when you grow up. And like, I definitely live that life. But my parents were definitely like, you can be a teacher when you grow up. You will be a teacher when you grow up. My brothers work in schools, they're teachers, like everybody's a teacher because they're just like, why would you do anything else? Like, that was it. That was the plan, right? So I went to Hunter, I became a teacher, and I worked in New York City public schools, which I wasn't really thinking I was going to do. And then here I was. But I wasn't thinking I was going to do it because I had no idea what I was going to do. But and very quickly it becomes so obvious how how incarceration, arrest, all the trauma that is wound up in that impacts student learning. Like, it was a shock to me. I didn't really know anybody who was like arrested or incarcerated when I was a kid. And then here's like young people talking about it all the time. And I was shocked. I started teaching when I was like 21. I was like 3 years older than some of my students. And, I learned so much about how that impacted their reading level, their attendance, which really impacts their reading level. Just everything was all bound up. And as I progressed, I was a teacher for 10 years. I was also a school leader. I was assistant principal in the South Bronx, and then I was a dean in Santa Monica. And during all of that, I kind of was like, maybe if I can keep kids out of jail, then we can increase their educational attainment, and that was really what it was just sort of another angle to attack the problem. But it I mean, it's too big of a problem. But that was my thinking. That was what motivated me to do that. I wouldn't have gone to law school like for any other reason. Um, that's what happened. If that makes sense. Do you want to hear a
So,
specific story?
absolutely.
Okay. So I keep thinking about this story as sort of like a defining moment, but I had this really awesome kid. I won't say his name. We'll just call him DB. And he was so annoying, but so fun and like passionate about learning, and was at school every day. He was the first kid there. Just like, you never know with the first kids there if they're just like trying to get out of their house or if they're like just excited to be, it's probably a combination of the two. Um, but he was just sort of a very memorable student out of the hundreds of students. And one time he missed like 4 days of school, which was very out of character for him. And I was really nervous. And like after 3 days, I started calling his mom. And finally she picked up and she was like, he was arrested. And I was like, what? Like, for what? How is that even possible? And I was like, why didn't you go get him? And she was like,
How old is he at this point?
16. He was
Okay.
16. Um, and she was like, I'm not a citizen, so I don't think I can go get him out. And I was like, no, you can. Like, but she had no idea. And she was worried that if she went and got him, they would be deported. And, she just had no idea. And he had never been in trouble before. And this was all like, so then he comes to school the next day and he's really smelly, like, which was also unlike him. He had pretty good hygiene, like very upset. And as soon as he got into the class, just like was crying, because she left him in the jail for 4 or 5 days. He was just like, he was shook, and it completely changed him. Um, he eventually found himself again, but I would say for the next like month or two, and this is like a strong character boy, like for the next month or two, he was just like, you know, wouldn't really talk, didn't want to be called on, didn't want any attention. And I was just like, this is so. Oh, and what he ended up doing that got him arrested in the first place was like he and his friends were throwing eggs at each other. They lived in a project. So like they were in the yard, which is like public property. So again, my analogy, if they were living in a house with their own backyard, throwing eggs at each other, nothing would happen. But he was arrested for like vandalism and, something assault, um, which is like 16-year-old boy basic stuff, right? And I don't know. That was like the beginning of, for me, like maybe there's some other way to like help this reading problem.
So bring me into this. So why were you representing him at 16?
I wasn't representing him. I was his teacher. He was in my class.
Got it.
Yeah.
And that's the triggering point that made you want to get into law.
Yeah, that's why I was like, maybe, yeah, that's when I really started thinking like there's another avenue at this. And I don't know, I just always felt so disappointed in the like involvement of their representation, which now I understand was really unfair. Like now I realize like how much is on like the public defender's plate and like everything they're dealing with. But at the time, I was like, who's more important than my students? Nobody's more important than my students. Like, why is this happening to them? And I was like outraged. And that's good because that was like what catapulted me to do this. But, then I learned like it's just the same mess, just a different skill set, I guess.
Did you realize at that point the what I would imagine the emotional weight of what you would ultimately end up doing in representing them?
Um, so I didn't think it would be very different from the emotional weight of the students that I had in my classes, and I think I was right. I think it was the same amount of emotional weight. It was a little bit more um bullshit. Like it was a little bit more dealing with so many people, whereas like as a teacher, because I like accepted my responsibility for their like progress in reading to be like, it was like paramount to me. I was like crazy about it, because to me it's like this is the number one divider, right? It's like if you can't read at that level, you're automatically disqualified from so many things. And I took it very seriously as I take like the freedom of a young person. So I think it was as heavy. They were both very heavy, but that one was also, being an attorney was also annoying too, because it was just like DAs are so annoying and like, so many more people involved that you have to manage, which when you're a teacher, you kind of just deal with like your principal and your students and their parents, but it's parents there too. I don't know. So it's just a different,
Yeah, I mean,
but same.
my my mom was a teacher, and reading was something that was just drilled into my head, and I'm grateful for that. I became a better reader, but a few things about reading, and I think you focus on it because the opening scene is in a library,
Hmm.
and a lot of kids are not reading, but there's a couple that are,
Hmm.
and that reading is the portal to another life.
Hmm.
It allows you to experience other forms of empathy. People who read more tend to be more empathetic because they can see different perspectives. They also wire their neurons differently. When you're teaching, what did you find to be most effective? It seems like motivation is probably where you need to start, right? I mean that's number one, and you referencing books that are going to be easy and fun for them to read. But what reinforced that to allow you to sort of harness that into more educated, educational driven curriculum?
Um, well, I was very lucky with like a wonderful mentor who's still my mentor today. And he lives in LA now too, which is so great. And he was like so generous with like not only himself and like teaching us how to be better teachers, but also like so many interesting trainings we went to that like helped cultivate all of this. Like I had no idea, right? Like I learned so much just from like my principal and my assistant principal who really like taught us how to do that. And then you sort of get creative with each individual student based on their interests, right? So then you're more equipped with all these tools. At the time we were practicing these reading strategies, which I think now are like passe. So now we're like, oh no. And everybody's moved from like that sort of balanced literacy model to like a phonics model, which we didn't focus on that much. But I did a lot of like sight words because my students were so low level. But basically, I would say like definitely focusing on interests of students and then finding ways that they can connect to stories that don't seem like they would immediately be interesting to them. Is all about making connections. And that would be really satisfying because you would see them like, oh, okay, like make the actual connection. I mean, that's what teaching and learning is all about is like you said, wiring those synapses. And I think that like I was just really lucky to land where I did with the staff that I did because everybody was so knowledgeable and passionate and willing to like train and send us to training.
Um, so talk to me a little about you don't just get up and say I'm going to go to law school. There's some prep work that goes into it, and then you actually have to go, and then you got 3 years of hitting the books pretty hard.
Yeah.
I want to sort of hear what at that point you had a professional career. How old are you at this point when you're going to law school?
Well, I graduated in 2017, so I was 35.
Something. Okay.
So I went when I was 33. I was
Okay.
definitely the oldest person in my class.
And how did that feel?
Crazy, really crazy. It felt really weird, because I mean, I still don't feel like I'm as old as I am, right? So like being 33, you feel so young, and then you're like hanging out with 23-year-olds every day, and you're like, oh, right, right, right. And it was
Very different.
kind of cool because it was like, on one hand, sort of alienating, but on the other hand, like I had all my friends already, so I didn't need to like. But my classmates were so sweet, and I'm still friends with some of them, and they were very supportive. But I was not the best law student. Um, but it was I say this to anybody, it's like such a privilege to go to law school. And if you ever can, like take the time and you have the money, you should just go because it rewires your brain in such a fantastic way. And I just like really enjoyed that part of it to like look at the
What?
world completely differently than I used to look at the world.
Give me some examples of that.
So, okay, great example. Like being a teacher, right? And just being angry all the time, like, where's the money for this? And like, why are they still in jail? And da 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 da. And then you go to law school and you realize, like, oh, okay, here's like a 3-step process that to like access the money that we need or to work around something to get. It's like so much more specific problem solving and fact-based problem solving than my prior 33 years, which was like emotional based problem solving. Like just like pure instinct and emotional problem solving. And now I feel like I'm much more like, oh yeah, I could see why that's a problem. Here's some ways we could think about looking at it. It's just like a much more it for me it was so calming and it made my brain way more efficient than just sort of like constantly spinning out of control. Um so I really like that part of it. I was really confused by law school because I was so like smart up until then, and then I was like not the best at law school, and it really like messed with me. Um, but whatever, you just have to graduate. You
Well,
don't, you don't have to like you don't have to have all A's. You just have to graduate, which I did.
I was going to ask that because you're out of academia. You're not a student for at least a decade, and you go back. Um, and the coursework in law school is significant. It's enormous, right?
Yeah.
And the amount of reading and the pressure. I mean, especially as an adult, you have to sort of get your endurance back, I would imagine. Was it challenging during that time frame to recommit to why you were doing it? I mean, to some degree, I think the fact that that was your purpose, the fact that you wanted to go back and fight for these kids, was maybe what allowed you to continue on. Because without something like that, I would suggest, if I started law school at 23, I would get through it because I needed to get a job.
Hmm.
But if I had had some life experience, I would have needed a stronger pull than just going to law school for the sake of getting a law degree.
Yeah, I mean, the first year you're so slammed, you don't really have time to think about it, and I was just like, I just have to do this because I like committed to it and I wanted to see if I could. And then starting in the second year, I was participating in and one of the reasons why I picked Loyola Law School is they have a really solid juvenile justice clinic. So starting my second year, I could all my classes were to do with that. I was actually able to I was certified by the state to actually represent clients in court even though I was still in law school. They call it certified law clerking. You're under the supervision of almost immediately starting my second year, I had all these opportunities to do the work that I wanted to do. So that really kept it alive for me, because even while I'm doing all my coursework, I'm also working on someone's case. And so it was like I knew I had to do it because I he was relying on me or whatever. And so that really helped. But yeah, I needed that. And then, you spend your summers clerking. And the first summer I did at the Inner City Law Center, which is like Skid Row's only legal representation. And that was really cool. And so I was like, maybe I just want to do this because, like, obviously in Los Angeles, like housing is so crazy too, So I was sort of like pulled in that direction. But then when juvenile justice started, the clinic started, I was like, okay, I'm back. Like that's what. But I continued to volunteer for, like they used to have clinics once a month at the inner city law center, so I would continue to volunteer once a month during law school to like provide free housing advice to whoever, and that was really satisfying. But then I worked at the San Francisco Public Defender's Office has a designated juvenile unit, and that's where I worked my between my second and third year, and that was like the best. And so that was sort of like exactly what I wanted to do. And it was just like the culmination of everything coming together. It was really great.
I just because I want to make sure that there's a few things that I want to keep going through, and I got some questions, but I
Okay.
want to make sure I hit sort of the bigger ones. So you get through law school. Now you're doing exactly what you wanted to do, right? And you hesitate there, so I hope you can explain that. But what's your experience like? I mean, how long were you doing this for, before you started having thoughts about writing?
So really it was just I was doing it until the pandemic. And then it was very strange. I had just left the Defense Fund and started working at the Legal Aid Foundation because they were looking for someone to run like a housing clinic in the basement of the Inglewood courthouse. And I was like, oh, this is kind of, I was still into that from working at the Inner City Law Center. And I also thought of it as like, I was kind of missing like teaching, and there was something like vibey about that. Like, all right, we'll be working with people and preparing them for the courtroom themselves. And I liked that, like teach a man to fish mentality of the job instead of just always relying upon other people to represent you and whatever. So I had taken that job like 2 weeks before the pandemic hit. But then because it was in a courthouse and all the courthouses were shut down, um, and then also I was pregnant, which was like I couldn't reconcile like before the courthouse just shut down, I was still required to go to work every day, and I was like, I don't want to get this disease nobody knows about and maybe disease my long sought after child, right? So I was like, so I quit, like, and then they shut the court down. And so then I was just like pregnant during the pandemic, the world shut down. It was like a time off, and I was like breathing for the first time, like napping for the first time, and I started having all these, like, I was journaling a lot because I was like, "Oh, I have all these stories that, like, I don't wanna lose them, and what if, like, something happens? I want, like, my child to read these whatever." And then when she was born, you know how it is, like, babies sleep all the time. So then I was, like, not pregnant, I felt so much better. She was born, and I just started writing, like, I wrote a novel, a play, and this movie.
So, which is all sort of their own subject that I'd like to dig into. But what made you choose this movie as sort of the launch pad? How did you start to consider floating it around for something more than just on paper sitting in your own files?
I mean, it's just I don't know, belongs in the world. Like, it's just so moving to me. And it's which sounds really weird to say about something you've created, but like it really feels I want other people to see it. I want other people to know. And um, it felt the most urgent, I guess, to get out of the files and share with people. It also
And
seems
so,
the
what was
easiest to me. This is like a false sense of confidence, but like because I know so many people who work in the film industry, it felt like, oh, I could do this, whereas like to publish a novel, like I don't feel like I have that understanding of
totally?
that industry or whatever. So it did feel like the easiest hurdle too. Even though that's ridiculous, like I understand that objectively, but given like my friends and whatever, I was able to just feel like, oh, I think I can make this happen.
I'm not sure I understand why you think that that would be ridiculous. Because if you've got contacts, you start with what you know, right? I mean,
Yeah.
that seems to make sense.
Yeah. I think it's just like
Um,
go ahead.
I was just going to ask. So what was your next step? I mean, when you started coming to the thought that, look, this is something I need to put out there. This has merit to it, and I think the world should be exposed to this story. What's your first call? How do you start putting that together?
So my first call is my best friend, whose name is Jess Kelly, who is casting director extraordinaire, and she is just like, she knows everybody. She helps make movies all the time. She does TV shows too. And I just asked her like, is this something? Is this anything? Or is this like embarrassing? Luckily, she's my best friend since I was like 12 years old. So I could like trust her with this. And she was like, I really like it. And I think we should make it. She's always open to like producing something. So I was like, okay, how do we like make it? How do you do that? And she was like, well, first, I want to introduce you to my friend Paul James, who is um, he's an actor, but he's been dying to get into directing. And since this is a short film, I'd met him over the years, but hadn't really like spent so much time with him. And so I sent it to him and said, like, I hear you want to get into directing. Do you like this script? And he was like, I love it. Let's talk about it. So then we met with Jess. I was like immediately into it because I had kind of known him enough that I felt like we had like a really easy back and forth. And I didn't really want a situation where I was just like, here's my script. Like, it's so personal to me. And if it's done wrong, I would be really mad because it's so often I feel like young Black teenage males are portrayed in such a like disrespectful way. And I was like, this can't happen with these boys. Like, I love them. And let's make sure this is like done right. And so I couldn't just hand it over. And so then we like worked on shortening it a little bit. And, he asked me a lot of questions about, we sort of like came up with another draft of it, and then Jess started showing it to producer friends of hers, and Hungry Bull, they produce a bunch of indie films and some feature films, loved it, and they produced it like pretty quickly because they wanted it to be done to submit to Sundance. So we're still like we have like a final cut pretty much tonight. We should be getting it, and we're submitting it next Friday, which is crazy because we just shot it in July. But um, that's how it all happened. Like before we knew it, They came on board in May and we shot it in July.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
That I don't think that I've ever heard of a story with that quick a turnaround.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe a testament to how moving the script is itself. I'm curious how much it changed from the original to what it is now, and sort of the back and forth between you and the rest of the crew.
Not much changed at all. Just the scene with the lawyer was much longer. It's already way too long, and in like our editing, we've already cut a lot of it, but it was even longer. Um, and that's pretty much it. Like choice of words here and there. And no, I always knew what the story was. Like in completion, I was not really trying to change that much of it. Like we had gotten a lot of feedback that like the ending should change, and I'm like, no, that's the whole point. Like if you think the ending should change, this is not a movie for you. And so I was like really happy that the director and everybody who read it was like on board with the ending. It was kind of like it's like who's Jon Snow's father, mother. Like if you don't know, you're not really included in this in the making of this movie. um, yeah, and then I had like I had really. Have you ever read The Fortress of Solitude by Jonathan Lethem?
No.
So I mean, I don't want to talk too much, but basically another like really great story of like two young boys growing up in Brooklyn, and there's a lot of like supernatural elements, like magic elements. And when I was first like thinking about Attack on Titan, and um, I kind of wanted like there to be a sort of magic to Kadeem, like when if he is like, for example, if he's climbing a fence, he like can fly over it, or like just this sort of like um and that's the only thing that like never really came to fruition. I think that's kind of fine. I think it's fine without it, but that was one idea that like I liked and Paul really liked, and we kept thinking about how we can make that happen. And I don't think that's going to happen, but that was like it's really the only thing that I feel like, oh, that could have been interesting to explore, but it's a short film. You don't really have the time for that.
What's your experience been like? Sort of seeing your baby outside of your control to some degree, or to a large degree, because once I mean you're not directing it anymore. The producers get involved and are notorious for changing a number of things. Maybe that didn't happen here, but you also had to just be prepared for that potentially to happen. I'm just, what's your sentiment? What's your take now, getting to this point? Obviously, it hasn't been released yet, so there's a whole future that you can't speak to yet. But up until this point, what's this experience been like?
Um, it's been really cool because I kind of went in like, all right, all these people know more than me about how to make movies, how to make movies people want to watch. And I really wanted people to watch it. So I was like, I'm going to be open to any suggestions that make this highly watchable. I don't want it to disappear, right? So I think that's been really helpful because it's sort of removed my emotions from it. I'm not like, I mean, yesterday we had sort of like a very frame by frame feedback session, and I was very nervous that like a very important part, the white boy handshake, would end up being cut, and I was like, we can't. It was like the only time I felt like, no, we have to do this. And for now, I think it's still in, but like I don't know that it'll forever make it. But I think I just tried to like enjoy it as much as possible because it's such an amazing experience, and I don't know if I'll ever get it again. And um just it's scary, but it's scary in the best way. And I think because I fully trusted everybody involved, it was like they're never going to do anything cheap with it, or anything. They totally understood my point about like really respecting the circumstance, and it's so clear from when you watch it how much everybody respected the circumstance, and that's really like that was my, bottom line. I feel like it was met, and anything else I feel like if it's going to make it more watchable, okay, right? So I just feel like it was an open experience. I wasn't nervous about other people unless they were going to screw it up. I'm more nervous about like I don't know. It just feels so surreal still. It's hard to like imagine it being watched by people other than those that have only been involved in it.
Well, and that's sort of when I'm most interested about, because you wrote this as a means to capture these stories, and then this story came out and surfaced to you as is among the more important ones. And I'm wondering if your perspective on what the future holds for this story, you know, not maybe even specific to Kadeem, but the story
Mm.
behind the story. Has this changed now that you're seeing? I mean, this went from something inside your head to now potentially being inside, in front of the eyes of many, many different people. Are there goals that are changing? Are there, um, green lights in front of you that you haven't thought of before that are starting to present themselves? How is this metamorphosis occurring real time?
Um, yeah, I think so. I think that, um, I mean, spending so much time focusing on it in the like leading up to the shooting of it, I was really like, it's a little bit dated at this point because so much has already changed in the juvenile justice system, but this is like from when I was working there, let's say 2016, 2017. So some has changed. Like in fact, we were able to shoot at a former detention center that like I used to have clients at because it's empty now. So there's stuff that's already changing meta, right? But I was really missing the work. Like I was really thinking about like, all right, I think I'm going to go back into it when this is over because I really miss it. And then we shot it and like being on the set and like, just sort of like the insane creativity and like skill that I've never seen before. It was just like, oh no, I'm like definitely gonna do this again. This is way more fun. And like what a different adventure, right? Like just feels like to I mean, I don't I don't personally have like major goals. I think it's a perfect short film. I like love it as a short film. Um but like if something were to happen, like I can see other stories that could come out of it or make it richer or bigger. But I also have like other stories I would also like to tell. So, but I would say in real time, it's inspiring me to keep writing more and not inspiring me to go back to working as like a juvenile defense attorney.
Something I find in a lot of achievers is that there are opportunities presented to themselves through intention or circumstance that speaks to them such that they end up pursuing it further beyond what some might just sort of allow it to, pass through. And uh, two adjectives continue to come to mind as we've been going through this. One is educator, the other is advocate. And alluding to sort of what you were saying back when you were a teacher, you nothing is more important than these kids. But how can I maybe affect more change? And what I find interesting is that you went into the legal system to do that, and now you're landing in sort of an entertainment world where that bullhorn can actually be even louder, in a way that you've never been able to accomplish that without having gone through these sort of different iterations. And I'm wondering, sort of going through that process and with the theme of advocate and educator, how has that shaped your being a mother?
Huh. Um, I think it makes me really confident because I can very clearly see when like surface level it seems like I'm kind of all over the place, right? Like, oh, she was a teacher, then she went to law school, and now she's trying to be in the movies. Like, what's wrong? But it's like a very clear through line of like a values based life, right? That like I believe in something is right and something is wrong, and like everything that I've been doing so far has been walking in the same path. It's just been a creative way of getting there, and that makes me feel good because I feel like my daughter will have a clear understanding of those things because my husband who works in basketball but we met teaching at the same high school in Brooklyn. So it's like we also share those like very strict sort of justice, inclusion, kindness, empathy, and also like not lazy, like not just acknowledging that these things exist, but trying to work to make them better. And I feel like that makes me feel like a good mother if I could instill those things in her, and the fact that like I keep coming across these opportunities to like express myself in these ways, I feel like she will too.
What a great answer. I did not expect that to be your response. I think that was a lot more all encompassing than I expected.
What were
I'm
you
curious.
expecting?
Not that I don't know what I was expecting, but that was I think that was a really good answer. So, what's you alluded to some more writing. I'm curious. What do you think? I'm not holding you to it, but what are you passionate about doing next? Or I mean, I know you mentioned you had a novel. You
Yeah, I
had some
kind of
other
want to like
stories.
see if I can get that in the world. But now I'm also like, now I've got this like movie bug and I have like a couple ideas. But they're all funny, I think. Which I'm like, I think I'm funny, but I don't know if that will like um translate. So I don't know. I'm gonna start writing a few and see if any like have a flow to them. But yeah, um, I think I'm gonna finish this novel. It's almost done. I'm almost done with the second draft. That's why it's been taking so long. It's like the second draft is really tedious, Like I added a cat, so now there has to be like a cat in every scene, and I have to go back. Um, but it's like a murder mystery. It's not serious like the movie is. I kind of want that to be in the world too because it's really fun. It's about a teacher, which is cool. And then I think I'm going to start these scripts that I have. One I've kind of already started, but it's about basketball wives, and Judd won't let me. But it's funny.
So I'll start to wrap this up, but the creative process is very easy to. I think people think creatives just flounder around and let inspiration strike. But I'm curious, what's your day to day like? What's your discipline, your system to the drive to go through a second draft without an editor? By the way, there's no deadline that's pushing you to do this. What is your system that keeps you sharp and pushing
um,
day to day? Like wake up, go to bed. What happens in between?
well, like right now, like nothing. Like I wake up and I like get my daughter ready for school, drop her off at school, and like work out for an hour or two, and then like eat lunch, maybe do grocery shopping. Like I'm not doing anything right now. But when I am in a disciplined mood, I wake up, work out, and write for 2 hours. And I like to write somewhere where I can eat lunch so that if I'm still feeling it, I can keep going. And then if I'm not feeling it, I can go home and eat lunch. So that's been that has what worked really well for me in the past was just like find somewhere. I like different places. I like to switch it up because I think like watching other people is really fascinating. And so that's really 2 to 3 hours a day, 4 days a week. And then that was how I was able to get like all this written. And it was really like I would do like a word goal. So like say I would that day I would pick 1,000 words, and if I only was able to write like 500 words, then I would just like free write. A friend of mine who teaches writing taught me this. He's like, just make a goal of 20 minutes and just write whatever comes to your mind, and then I would just do that for practice, and then the next day I would come back and like see where I picked up. Um, but I have like a really, I think all of my like professional and even like growing up with like the responsibilities I had growing up in a nursery, I think like there's not my brain doesn't function in like, well, I'm not really done. Oh well. You know what I mean? There's no like it's like no, I have to finish it. And like I also am like I'm trying not to be as competitive as I used to be, but I'm still like pretty competitive with myself. And I'm like, well, you said you were going to finish this novel. Go finish this novel, Tiffany, you know what I mean? Like you said you were going to do it. So there's a lot of like personal pressure that I put on myself to like, I don't know,
Where
do,
does that come from?
I don't know, youngest child. Um, I think youngest child.
Your writing, is it how do you divvy up between writing and editing?
Um, I just write through and then like go back and do the whole thing.
you doing it all on
Like I
Word? Or
don't
are
like
you using an?
I don't I was using I took this like UCLA extension class, how to write a murder mystery, and the teacher recommended what's it called? It's like a weird Scrivener. Scribner.
That's what I was gonna. That's what I
So I
thought
was
it would
writing
be.
on
Yeah.
that, but I found it to be like somewhat cumbersome after a while. And I wrote the movie on Word, and now I just finally got final drafts. So I've been loving that and writing on that. And then I think I'm just gonna write I'm gonna finish this second draft in Scrivener because I have all my notes and everything there, and then I think I'm gonna um, go back to Word for the book.
I think we'll wrap this up with this last question. What's on your mental diet? What are you reading? What podcasts are you listening to? What's motivating you? What's keeping you inspired? And
Well, I just read the like over 1,000 word Barbara Streisand autobiography, and I listened to it because she reads it, and that will fuel me for years. But it did ruin my podcast diet because every time I was listening to anything, I was listening to Barbara, and it took months to listen to it. It's an over 48-hour audiobook. And it was so great. It's like one of the best books I've ever read. I was always like mildly obsessed with her, but now I'm like I'm all in. She's fabulous. Oh my god. So, I just finished that and then I read the Miranda July book about like have you heard about her latest book? It's kind of like a woman's midlife crisis. She like lives in LA. She's a create and that was just so like I had to stop in the middle and take like a week off because I was like having like a I don't know, identity crisis. And then I went back and it's just like so funny and smart and inspiring just like to be able to write like that. So that's been really huge. And then another thing that I did, which has really changed everything, is I went back to subscribing to the New Yorker physical because we had like cut that out. You know, you get behind when you have a kid and stuff, and so we just were reading it on our iPads. And now that it's back physical, I've been reading it every week, and it's just like the best.
yeah, there's something special about the New Yorker.
Yeah.
How can people get a hold of you, and what type of people do you want to hear from?
Cool people only. Anybody really. I mean, I love talking to like educators and lawyers and writers. And I'm on LinkedIn, Meghanbest.
And when do you hear back? When you're submitting to Sundance this
Next,
Friday, which would
yep,
be
the
the
sixth.
are you the 30th or the
The
6th?
6th. And then I don't know when we hear back. I assume in December because it's in January. So like it's a pretty quick turnaround.
Yeah.
Um, but I don't know. I don't know how like
Well,
I think they get like 30,000 submissions or something. It's crazy.
I really enjoyed the script. I wish it well. I think whoever does see it, I'm excited to see it. I don't know what the final product looks like, but the words were moving and it was informative while being entertaining. So I really appreciate you being on.
Thank you.
Thanks.